I got home from a 6-month assignment overseas, dropped my suitcase in my own bedroom, and noticed a stranger's phone charger still plugged into the wall outlet beside my bed. I told myself it was probably my house sitter's. Then I found a hair tie that wasn't mine tangled in my sheets, a takeout menu from a restaurant 2 states away tucked in a drawer, and a guest book, an actual guest book with a leather cover sitting on my kitchen counter, filled with handwriting from at least a dozen people I had never met, thanking someone named Karen for such a wonderful stay. I remember standing there in my own bedroom, jet-lagged and disoriented in the specific way 6 months of research work in a remote location leaves you disoriented, staring at that charger for a long moment before my brain fully registered what I was looking at. It's such a strange, small object to be the first thread that unravels something this large. Not a smoking gun, just a plastic charging cable, plugged into a wall I'd left empty. My name is Melissa. I'm a marine biologist, which means my career involves extended research assignments, sometimes months at a time, in places without reliable internet or any real way to check in on my life back home. There's a particular vulnerability that comes with that kind of career, one I'd never fully articulated to myself until this happened. You build a life, a home, a sense of stability, and then you leave it completely unattended and unwitnessed for months at a stretch, trusting entirely that it will still be exactly as you left it when you return. 4 years ago, when I first started taking these longer deployments, my longtime family friend, Karen Whitfield, offered to house sit while I was away, collecting mail, watering plants, handling the occasional maintenance issue, the kind of genuine favor between old friends that I never once thought to question. Karen and I had known each other since college, close enough that she'd been in my wedding party years earlier during a marriage that ultimately didn't work out, close enough that our families had spent holidays together more than once. I paid her a modest monthly stipend for her trouble, and for 4 years, the arrangement worked exactly the way it was supposed to. I'd come home from a long assignment to a well-maintained house, healthy plants, and a neat stack of mail sorted by date. I trusted Karen completely. Standing in my bedroom that first evening back, staring at a charger that clearly wasn't mine, I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe Karen had a friend stay over once during a rough patch of her own. Maybe the guest book was some sentimental thing she'd picked up and left out, unrelated to anything specific. I actually sat down at my own kitchen counter and read a few of the entries before that explanation fully collapsed. And once I did, I understood immediately I wasn't looking at a sentimental keepsake. The entries weren't vague. They were specific, detailed, and addressed directly to Karen, thanking her for her hospitality, praising her recommendations for local restaurants, mentioning how comfortable the bed had been, how much they'd loved the view from what was unmistakably my own back porch. One entry, dated only about 3 weeks earlier, read, "Karen, thank you for such a warm welcome and the amazing coffee shop recommendation down the street. This house has such a peaceful energy. We'll definitely be back next time we're in town." I read that particular entry 4 or 5 times, feeling something cold settle into my stomach with each rereading. 3 weeks earlier, I had been on the other side of the world, entirely unaware that strangers were sitting in my own kitchen, drinking coffee, being personally welcomed by someone using my home as though it were hers to offer. I walked through my house room by room after that, slower and more deliberately than I've ever walked through my own home before, looking specifically now for anything that confirmed what I was afraid I already understood. Small things I hadn't registered on my first exhausted pass through the door. A drawer in the bathroom cabinet holding toiletries I didn't recognize, a brand of shampoo I've never bought, a half-used bar of soap that wasn't mine. My living room furniture arranged slightly differently than how I'd left it, close enough that I might not have noticed if I hadn't already been looking. My reading chair angled a few degrees, differently than the specific way I always leave it. A faint, unfamiliar mark on my hallway wall that looked like it had been scrubbed at, but not entirely removed. Roughly the height and shape of a rolling suitcase repeatedly bumping the same spot. In my linen closet, I found towels folded in a style I don't use, hospitality-style folds rather than my own careless method, the kind of detail that felt almost more unsettling than anything else because of how deliberately professional it looked. I called my brother David that same night, my voice unsteady in a way that surprised even me as I tried to describe everything I'd found. David works in software engineering, the kind of methodical, technically minded person who processes unsettling information by immediately looking for a way to verify it rather than sitting in the emotion of it first. I could hear him go quiet and focused on the other end of the line as I described the guest book, the charger, the rearranged furniture, the hospitality folded towels. Okay, he said, his voice steadying into something more analytical. Do you have any photos of the inside of your house from before you left? Anything on your phone? A few, I said. Why? Because if this is what it sounds like it might be, he said carefully, there's a way to check that doesn't involve just standing there speculating. I did have photos, a handful of casual pictures I'd taken months earlier, mostly of a new couch I was proud of, sent to my mother in a group chat about furniture shopping, plus a couple of photos from a small dinner party I'd hosted the week before I left. David asked me to send them over, and within about an hour, he called me back, his voice carrying a specific, controlled tension I recognized immediately as him trying to deliver bad news calmly. Melissa, he said, I found your house on a short-term rental platform. It's an active listing. The photos match your living room, your kitchen, your bedroom, down to the couch in the pictures you just sent me. Same throw pillows, same artwork on the wall behind the dining table. It's hosted under the name Karen W. There are dozens of 5-star reviews going back at least 6 months. I remember sitting on my own bedroom floor while he read me the listing description over the phone, a cheerful, well-written paragraph praising the home's cozy charm and convenient neighborhood location, phrases that could have applied to any of 100 houses, except that the photos underneath them were unmistakably, specifically mine. The listing title, David told me, was something like Charming Family Home Near the Water, and it was near the water because that's exactly why I bought it in the first place, a detail that somehow made the whole thing feel even more violating, like even my own reasons for loving my house had been repurposed into a marketing pitch. I read through the reviews myself once David sent me the link, and I want to be honest about how strange that experience actually was. These weren't complaints. They were warm, detailed, genuinely positive accounts of strangers' time in my home. Praise for the host's thoughtful welcome basket, for restaurant recommendations that were, I recognized immediately, actual places Karen and I had gone together over the years, for how peaceful they'd found sleeping in what one review specifically called the cozy back bedroom with the reading nook. I have a reading nook in my back bedroom. I built it myself, slowly, over the course of a year, exactly the kind of detail that made those strangers' warmth feel like a violation rather than anything resembling a compliment. I sat with all of this privately for almost a full day before deciding what to do next, replaying 4 years of an easy, trusted friendship in my head, searching for any sign I must have missed. Karen had never once, in any of our calls or messages during my long trips, given me any reason to suspect anything beyond the ordinary updates about my mail and my plants. That was, I think, the most disorienting part of the entire discovery, how completely normal everything on the surface had continued to look the entire time. I mentioned it, carefully and almost by accident, to my neighbor Grace the next morning, running into her while checking my own mailbox. Grace has lived next door for over a decade, retired now from years at the Postal Service, the kind of neighbor who genuinely notices the small rhythms of a street without ever being nosy about it. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, whether she'd noticed anything unusual at the house while I was away. Grace, without any prompting toward suspicion at all, said something that made my stomach drop in a completely different way. Now that you mention it, she said, pausing to think, there were a lot more cars than I'd have expected. Rolling suitcases. People I didn't recognize coming and going pretty regularly, especially on weekends. I just figured you had family visiting. Or maybe Karen was letting friends stay while you were gone. I didn't think much of it, honestly. Sometimes there'd be a car in the driveway I'd never seen before, gone again in 2 or 3 days, replaced by a different one. How long has that been happening? I asked her, trying to keep my voice steady. Gosh, I don't know exactly, she said, squinting slightly as she thought it through. Longer than I would have guessed, if I really think about it. Months, at least. I remember noticing it around the time my grandson started kindergarten, actually, which would put it back further than I initially would have said. Her grandson had started kindergarten nearly 9 months earlier. I did the math standing right there at my mailbox, feeling the actual scope of this stretch even further backward than David's initial estimate. Was I supposed to notice something was wrong? Grace asked, her expression shifting to something apologetic. I feel terrible now, thinking I should have said something. You had no reason to think anything was wrong, I told her, meaning it completely. None of us did. That's kind of the whole problem. Hearing Grace's uneasy corroboration confirmed something I'd been afraid to fully accept. This wasn't a recent lapse in judgment. It had been happening visibly to anyone paying even casual attention for a significant stretch of time, while I trusted completely that my home was simply sitting quietly empty and cared for. David dug further into the listing over the following days, pulling archived versions of the page through an old internet archive tool he used for work, establishing that the earliest reviews actually dated back closer to 8 months rather than the 6 I'd initially assumed. With a booking pattern that looked, in his words, essentially constant, new guests checking in almost as soon as the previous ones checked out. Based on the platform's typical fee structure and the listing's visible pricing and near constant booking frequency, David worked out a rough financial estimate that genuinely staggered me when he read it out loud. Conservatively, he said, I think Karen's probably cleared somewhere around $30,000 off your house over this whole stretch. Could be more. $30,000. I sat with that number for a long time, turning it over, trying to reconcile it with the version of Karen I'd trusted completely for 4 years, a woman I'd genuinely considered one of my closest friends. I called Karen directly once I felt I could manage the conversation without falling apart entirely. I kept my voice as calm and controlled as I could, asking her plainly whether she'd been renting out my house while I was away. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I almost asked again before she finally spoke. I can explain, she said, her voice already carrying the particular tone of someone who knows an explanation isn't going to be enough. It's not what it probably looks like. It looks like you've been running a business out of my home for at least 8 months without telling me, I said. What am I missing? She didn't deny it after that. She told me it had started about a year into the arrangement, during a financially difficult stretch for her and Tom, and that she'd told herself at the time that it was simply an efficient use of a house that was sitting empty anyway, that no real harm was being done since I was thousands of miles away and never would have known the difference. I told myself I'd mention it eventually, she said, or pay you some kind of share once things stabilized for us. I just never actually did either, and then it just kept going, and it got harder to imagine bringing it up the longer it went on. I didn't offer forgiveness on that call, and I don't think I owed it to her in that moment. But I understood, in a way that complicated my anger without erasing it, that this hadn't begun as some calculated long-term scheme so much as a small, rationalized decision she'd never found a way to stop repeating once it started working. I learned, a few days later, through a mutual friend rather than from Karen herself, that her husband Tom had genuinely known nothing about any of it. He called me himself, his voice shaking in a way that told me immediately how blindsided he actually was. I need you to know I had no idea, he said. None of this makes any sense to me. I don't even know what to say to her right now. I believed him completely. Whatever accountability belonged to Karen, none of it extended to a husband discovering his own wife's secret alongside me. David and I brought everything we'd compiled, the archive listing history, the review timeline, Grace's corroborating account, the financial estimate, to Detective Ben Castellano, who handles property fraud cases for our local department. We sat in a small conference room at the station, papers spread across the table, while Castellano reviewed everything methodically, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and how exactly David had traced the archived listing history. Castellano listened to the full account without much visible surprise. The calm of someone who has unfortunately seen a rising number of exactly this kind of case as short-term rental platforms have become more widespread. This is becoming a more common pattern than people realize, he told us. Unauthorized subletting through these platforms, sometimes by house sitters, sometimes by tenants themselves subletting without a landlord's knowledge. The financial fraud is serious enough on its own. But I want to flag something else you may not have considered yet. He was right that I hadn't. Castellano explained that my homeowner's insurance policy almost certainly excluded coverage for commercial short-term rental use, which meant that if anything serious had happened during any of those 8 months, a fire, an injury, significant property damage, I could have been left personally, financially exposed with no insurance coverage at all, entirely because of an arrangement I never knew existed. I've seen cases where a guest was injured on a property being used this way without the owner's knowledge, he said. The owner ends up the named defendant in a lawsuit with an insurance company that has every legal right to deny the claim entirely, because the policy explicitly excludes exactly this kind of use. That realization genuinely frightened me more than the financial theft itself had. The money was real damage, concrete and calculable. The uncovered liability had been a silent, invisible risk hanging over my entire home for 8 months without my knowledge, the kind of danger I couldn't even fully process because it hadn't actually happened. It had simply been possible the entire time without my consent or awareness. What do I do about that going forward? I asked him. Talk to your insurance provider directly. Be fully transparent about what happened, and make sure your policy going forward explicitly addresses any future house-sitting arrangements, he said. Most policies have language you can add for exactly this kind of situation, but almost nobody thinks to ask for it until something like this happens. With Castellano's investigation and our compiled evidence, Karen was formally charged with fraud, and a civil settlement was eventually negotiated requiring restitution for the estimated rental income, along with repair costs for the accumulated wear and minor damage the constant turnover had caused to my home. The process took months to fully resolve, longer than I expected, though having an actual structured resolution in place, rather than just an abstract sense of owed justice, mattered more to me than I'd anticipated it would. My attorney explained that Karen's own financial situation meant full restitution would likely be paid in installments over an extended period, which frustrated me initially, though I've since made a kind of uneasy peace with the pace of it, understanding that a structured plan, even a slow one, is still meaningfully different from nothing at all. Karen's place in my life has changed completely, and, I think, permanently. We haven't spoken since the settlement was finalized. About 4 months after everything concluded, I received a letter from her in the mail, handwritten, apologizing in language that read as genuinely remorseful rather than defensive. She wrote about how ashamed she felt, how she thought about the specific moment she could have told me the truth and chose silence instead, over and over, until silence became its own kind of habit she didn't know how to break. I read it twice. I haven't responded, not out of continued fury exactly, but because I'm honestly not sure what a response would accomplish at this point, or what kind of relationship, if any, could reasonably follow something this sustained and rationalized for this long. Some days I think I might write back eventually. Most days, I don't feel any particular urgency to decide. Tom and Karen's marriage, as far as I understand secondhand, has survived this, though I imagine it looks different now than it did before, the way any marriage would after one partner discovers the other kept something this significant hidden for the better part of a year. I don't know the details of how they worked through it, and I've been careful not to ask. That part of the fallout isn't really mine to carry, beyond the simple fact that Tom, blindsided and innocent in all of this, deserved better than finding out about his own wife's secret business alongside a stranger's police report. I set up actual home monitoring before my next long assignment, cameras covering the main living areas, an arrangement I never would have considered necessary before any of this happened. My next house sitter, a colleague's sister who came recommended through work rather than personal friendship, knew about the cameras from the start, and I think, honestly, we were both more comfortable with the transparency than either of us expected to be. It's not that I've stopped trusting people entirely. It's that I've learned, the hard way, that trust and verification were never actually supposed to be opposites, no matter how uncomfortable it felt to accept that for the first 36 years of my life. I used to think needing to verify something meant you didn't really trust the person. I understand now that the healthiest version of trust was never blind in the first place. She spent 6 months telling herself an empty house was simply going to waste. She just never planned on a leather guest book, of all things, being the detail that finally gave her away.